Other questions? Is there a skillful way to eat carbohydrates or bread? There is. I would limit it to 1 day a week, is the short answer. If you're going to consume it more frequently, then what you'll need to do, the chapter to read would be damage control. So in the chapter damage control, we don't have to go into the problems with the calories in, calories out model. Newton wasn't wrong. Thermodynamics are still, they're still intact, but the way nutritionists interpret calories in, calories out doesn't make any sense. But I ate almost 7 times my resting metabolic rate and then logged in with lower body fat 2 days later. And the way that you do that, among other things, is by improving your insulin sensitivity and diverting more calories to muscle as opposed to fat. And you can do that through supplementation using things like alpha lipoic acid. Maybe I need another green tea. Alpha lipoic acid, among others, chromium polynicotinate, which is branded as chromate. I would actually recommend alpha lipoic acid more than chromate. Or doing very brief muscular contractions, performing very brief muscular contractions, let's say 90 seconds of like air squats in the bathroom, as weird as that sounds, just before your main course comes out, can also really minimize the damage. And that has to do with something called GLUT4, which are glucose transporters. Kind of a long story. But you can minimize the damage, but if you consume bread, for example, consistently, then it usually does quite a bit of damage. There is a diet that I think is very fascinating just from a behavioral standpoint. I think it's called the Montignac. I could be wrong about this. It's a French diet, and the basic rule is that you can't eat fat and carbs at the same time. So you can eat all the bread you want, you just can't have any butter, for example. And what you find is you just stop eating bread because it's so boring. And if you're eating the fat and you don't eat the carbs, then you're not going to put that fat down, generally speaking, as body fat. So you can separate out the two, but if I'm going to eat bread, I want to enjoy it. If I'm going to eat carbohydrates, I want chocolate croissants, I want bear claws, I want good stuff, as opposed to like bread without butter. That sounds miserable. So I'd say 1 day a week, and just keep a list of the things that you want to eat while you're staving off those impulses, and then you can go ballistic, and you could eat. Yeah, quinoa. So there's a reason the birds don't eat quinoa when it's being harvested. It has natural protection in the form of saponins and other things that can do a lot of damage to the gut. Is it better than eating Wonder Bread? Absolutely. Does it have more protein than rice? Absolutely. Does it keep for a long time? Yeah, absolutely. If I'm trying to gain mass, I will actually eat quinoa in many cases. But if the goal is extended, if the goal is health, and I use that air quotes because it can mean anything and everything, or fat loss, then I would minimize the grain consumption. And as a side note, the grain consumption can have a very negative effect on female fertility. I won't go into like all the details of it, but I've seen dozens of cases where it's just miscarriage. You get rid of gluten, you get rid of gluten, and you add in more fat, and boom, like one shot, one kill, pregnant within 2 weeks. So, just a side note. I had to use a sniper reference. I had to figure out a way to get it in. Any other questions? I love tea of almost any variety, as long as it's not sweetened. So anything from ginger to black to pu'er to green. Pu'er tea, which tastes really earthy. Most people won't like it. P-U-E-R-H. Spent a lot of time in China drinking pu'er tea with Kevin Rose and Glenn and a few others. Is really effective for fat loss. It's also a very strong stimulant if you get enough of it, and those two often go together. Green tea is very interesting for a few reasons. And it's hard to get the effect by drinking green tea because you'll be bouncing off the walls or like shaking and convulsing if you have enough of it to achieve this effect. But the EGCG in green tea, if you take it in, let's say, a decaffeinated green tea supplement, if you're taking 325 milligrams 3 times a day, hypothetically, it can help to trigger fat cell death. Okay, now why is this interesting? This is really interesting because the reason people regain fat so quickly, one of the reasons, is that when you get fat, you multiply the number of fat cells, and then you lose the weight, and the fat cells get smaller, but they don't go away. So it's just like muscle memory, but for fat. It's a damn pain in the ass. And green tea, though, can trigger apoptosis. So basically cell suicide in mature fat cells. It's pretty cool. So, quite aside from the fact that it's a nice little buzz you get from green tea. My preference would be yerba mate, though, if you're going for any type of creativity elixir. It has 3 different stimulants, I guess. Theobromine, theophylline, and caffeine, so you get 3 different peaks, so you don't crash. So yerba mate, that's what we need more of here. Oh, sorry? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a lot of it's cycled on a week. Is there a reason for that? It's mostly for compliance purposes. It's not because there's any particular reason that it has to be once every 7 days. But the problem with the perfect program, or much of the what I would consider misinformation out there about diet and exercise, is that they're like, all right, here's the best program. You need to take bowling balls, duct tape them to your hands, and do wind sprints. It's like, awesome. I can lose a ton of fat doing that. Fantastic. Then you do one workout, you're like, this is horrible. I'm never going to do this again. And I think likewise, if you say, all right, you're gonna move it 32 hours, 37 hours, even if that's optimum, people won't do it. So for me, I just said, look, you're gonna be most social probably on a Friday or Saturday. Let's just make that your off day once a week. And the compliance is amazing. Of the people that I tracked, 58% said it was the first time they'd ever been able to follow a diet. And I do think that having it timed near the weekend or on the weekend is really important. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question was paleo and endurance training. How do you do the two? I would definitely encourage you to read the Ultra Endurance 2 chapter with Brian McKenzie, who eats paleo all the time. The way that he gets around it. So how do you keep your glycogen stores high, your muscular carbohydrate stores high if you're not eating starches? And what you don't want to do is, let's say, eat a big pasta meal the night before. What you want to do is during or after your long training runs, or whether they're even medium distance training runs, you want to replenish using something like Vitargo S2, which is waxy maize starch. And if you get that in the right window, then it'll go into your muscle as glycogen as opposed to as fat stores or screwing up your insulin sensitivity. So that's what I would do. I would just really focus very intelligently on glycogen replenishment both during and post-workout. And when I say post, I mean like within 5 minutes, which is gross. I mean, it's really horrible to consume like 1,000 calories of Vitargo within 10 minutes of finishing your workout. So I would actually encourage you to if you can, consume it during. It'll be a lot easier on the stomach. Yeah. I'm sorry? Why is wine okay? I think part of it is just a rationalization because I like wine. But wine it's not as damaging as many other types of alcohol, particularly if there are mixers. And because of the sulfites in wine, people usually cut themselves off. You could have 8 vodka tonics, but if you have 8 glasses of wine, you're going to be completely non-functional the next day. And the wine has a number of redeeming qualities. I'm not going to bullshit you, though. Like the amount of resveratrol for life extension in red wine is a joke. I mean, you have to consume a lot to have any impact whatsoever. But if you drink dry red wines like Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cab Sav tends to have high sulfite content, so I avoid it because it gives me headaches. If you avoid the whites, then you'll generally have a very low level of residual sugar, and it just doesn't spike your insulin much. If you don't want to be that guy who's at the club with your buddies and everyone's doing shots and you're like, I'll have a Cab Sav. And I'm like, what the hell's wrong with you? If you don't want to be that person, then you could have what's called a NorCal margarita. Really good stuff. This is from Rob Wolf, pretty well-known paleo guy. And it's high-grade tequila with a splash of soda and the lime juice from 5 whole limes. And the carbonation will get you drunk faster, so you consume less alcohol. And the lime juice will lower the glycemic impact of the tequila. Side note on tequila, just because that brought to mind agave nectar, stay away from it. It's like the big healthy thing. Fructose is really bad for you. And I'd say agave nectar is just a shade less damaging than high fructose corn syrup. It's, I think, 90% concentrated fructose. It's horrible for you. Don't do it. As a side note. Any other questions? Sugar and maple syrup. That's a really good question. I don't know. I really don't know. It's delicious stuff though, maple syrup. I love maple syrup. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I eat out 2 meals a day, probably. I love cooking. I hate cleanup, which is like the typical bachelor excuse, but I eat out all the time. It's actually it's quite easy. In terms of sourcing, let's just say for red meat, in San Francisco it's really easy. You can ask, and in most places, if you're eating just about anywhere, they'll have some type of answer for you. Because chances are they've had like 5 to 10 vegans come in and just grill the hell out of them about everything. So they're like, all right, that was a huge pain in the ass. Let's figure out what our stock answers are. But otherwise, you can forego if you don't know the source. Practically speaking, for me, there will be times when I'll eat meat and I don't know the source. But if you're traveling, let's say, through an airport and you don't want to do that, just get a bag of raw almonds, and that'll keep you sated for 10 to 12 hours. And if it comes down to it, depending on what your priorities are, you could simply be hungry for a few hours as opposed to breaking your rules, which is something most Americans haven't experienced. Which makes the intermittent fasting or protein cycling really interesting, because being a little bit hungry has a number of really interesting psychological, cognitive effects. From protein. And you can do that by consuming something like wheat. I don't recommend it, but in some cases, if you're really hungry, yes, you could have. In my case, let me tell you what protein cycling looks like. Once a week, my cheat day is Saturday. So Friday, I'll have an early slow-carb meal, high-protein meal. Let's just say around 6 o'clock. Try to go to bed early. It never works. That's okay. I'll have some wine. That'll help. Then I will wake up late, say 10 a.m. So where are we then? 6, 12, that's 16 hours. Probably have it a little, maybe dinner at 8 o'clock. That's a bit much. Wake up, have sourdough toast with some butter or ghee maybe, and some spinach and a glass of grapefruit juice. So the wheat or the sourdough, actually I'd have to check the sourdough. If it's wheat, it lacks lysine, so it's not a complete amino acid profile. Wait another 2 hours and then go have my bear claws and all that stuff. And by having that very limited period of protein cycling or protein fasting, what happens is the cellular cleanup mechanisms are triggered. And it's thought by some, I would say many researchers, that it's largely a matter of cleaning out the garbage faster than you build it up. As it relates to aging, telomeres would certainly be another factor. But also from a performance standpoint, when you limit your protein intake for a certain period of time, particularly if you're trying to gain weight, I think there's an overcompensation response where after that point of time you actually absorb, or your protein synthesis improves dramatically after the fact. That, I don't have much to support that other than N of 1 data set. Well, actually that's not true. I have a few other friends who I tested as well, like Neil Strauss, who's in the book. Other questions? Does yoga fit in anywhere? I think yoga's great, but there are a few things I would say as it relates to yoga. The first is that it's fantastic as recreation and can also be fantastic as exercise. The challenge is there's so many variables that it's difficult to determine, in some cases, the exact physical adaptation, that the variable that's responsible for certain adaptations. I've seen a lot of people injured in Bikram yoga because they are like, oh my God, I had no idea I was so flexible, and then they tear something. But I would say that it's helpful to distinguish between exercise, which I would just say is a dose of a certain type of movement or a load that produces a desired physical change, and then physical recreation, which can also have physical benefits. So, I mean, for me, like rock climbing, I love rock climbing, but that would be more in the recreation category as opposed to doing 5 minutes of kettlebell swings, which is super boring but has tremendous results in terms of body fat and body composition.